Hi, welcome to Elder Stories Episode 2. Today I got to sit down with a dear friend of mine and mother of some of my high school punk rock bandmates, Elizabeth Wright. She is a self-described flower child of the 60s, retired psychotherapist, horse lover, traveler, and has been married for an amazing 39 years. I'm really excited to share these stories where I got to learn about her life and get to know her better. Hi, Betsy. Thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice to have you. I have lots of great questions that I'm hoping I can learn more about who you are, because I know you mostly as my friend's parents, and it'd be great to learn about your whole life instead of just the small portion I know about. So,
I'd like that.
You ready to dive in?
Sure.
All right, so I was curious, what was something that you wish you had known before you started college, and particularly how that relates to being a woman trying to get an education at that time, where it was still a new thing to be an educated doctor as a woman?
It's a fascinating question. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a marine biologist. And I wanted to kind of dive under the sea and study things. And so I looked for all of the colleges that actually had biochemistry majors, because I needed both biology and chemistry. And I wish someone had told me, one, that biochemistry in the world of women in 1966 and 7 and 8 was really another way of saying nursing programs.
What do you mean by that?
Well, women didn't become doctors or marine biologists.
Just assistants.
They became nurses.
Yeah.
And so you needed both biology and chemistry. Like you would be usually a double major in biology and chemistry if you were a man. But they had biochemistry programs, which were really kind of pre-nursing programs, except they were called biochemistry, which seemed like exactly what I would want for marine biology, except that didn't get you into a master's program or into anything else. It sent you to nursing school.
So it was kind of a dead end?
Yeah.
For what you wanted to do.
Yeah, and I eliminated a whole lot of schools that looked really interesting to find one that was biochemistry. Turned out it was a women's school, which I didn't understand would also relate to women's school, finishing school, nursing, teaching, those kind of things.
So when you went to school, that's the school you chose, and it was an all-female campus?
Yes, because it had biochemistry.
Yeah. And teachers as well, or were there male teachers?
Oh, male and female.
Okay. Because, you always hear a lot about, abuse during college campuses, and was that not as big of an issue because it was an all-women's campus?
Again, I went to college in 1967, and the whole idea of abuse or anything, I'm sure that all existed, but it was not even a conversation back then.
So
and it certainly was not an issue that I knew about or I knew about.
It didn't affect you personally while you were in school?
No, except that I was in a school that really was looking to finish young women so they could marry young men and maybe become teachers and nurses between having children. Now,
the other schools that had these separate double majors, were you allowed to enroll in those schools?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I could apply anywhere I want. I think the question was, is there something that I wish I'd known? I just assumed, 1967 was kind of the precursor of the whole women's movement. And I think certainly I and most of my friends kind of were in that era of thinking we could do whatever we wanted and be whatever we wanted. And I just didn't really know that if you were a woman, what that really should have meant was that you still were applying to Harvard and Yale and Columbia and schools that were absolutely not traditionally women. In other words, we could be whatever we wanted, but we were going to have to go to places where pretty much men were doing them. We weren't going to go to a place, which I thought, I'm going to go to a small school, I'm going to be focused on my learning and not about men and women and all that stuff. And I want to be a marine biologist, so I'll study that. They seem to have a perfect program for that. And none of those things were true. So
were you not able to do that when you finished the school?
Well, I managed to drop out or flunk out or be a protester because that was also marches on Washington and
So
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, that's something that I'd love to hear more about. So, like, where were you living during this time?
Okay. I graduated high school in Virginia Beach, Virginia, kind of surfer capital of the East Coast. And I went to...
No, I was born in Virginia.
No.
Yep.
Where?
Charlottesville.
Charlottesville.
I lived there for 1 month before I moved to the West Coast.
It's okay. I was born in Key West, Florida. I lived there for a year, but it's similar. Charlottesville, and those are kind of really cool places, even though you didn't know them. So I went to school in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a school called Queens College. I think I also didn't know that it was Lutheran-based. I was really naive. I had my focus on biochemistry, marine biology. I can do anything I want.
Yeah.
So that's where I was living.
And is that close enough that you were driving to D.C. on the weekends to be in those marches?
No. What I was mostly doing was leaving campus and feeding marchers that were coming up from the South.
Okay, because there was like civil rights marches that were like traveling?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But no, I was not actually going to them. I was more of a support person.
Okay. And would you have considered yourself part of the hippie movement at that time? Was that your vibe?
I considered myself part of the flower child movement, to be
Was
distinguished.
There a difference between that?
Yes.
Please explain the difference
Sure.
between a flower child and a hippie
and a politico.
in 1967.
Yes. Hippies were pretty much doing as many drugs and having as much sex as they could, and rabble-rousing.
By rabble-rousing?
Oh,
getting into trouble?
Getting into trouble, sometimes maliciously, more often not, just in the free spirit of, things aren't the way they should be, let's do something else.
Yeah.
Politicos were clearly, they were all part of change in social, political, sexual mores. And politicos, though, were focused on political change, on protesting, on certain kinds of violent and nonviolent acts, on the history of all of those things, pretty serious, often. Well, that's that. Flower children were, some of them were doing a lot of drugs and having a lot of sex. I was not doing either of those things. But we liked flowers and we liked the environment, and we kind of had a really idealistic sense of change, morally, sexually, politically, communes and things. But it was from a really idealistic, socially conscious place.
So 50 years removed from that, and for someone who wasn't alive back then, it sounds like when you're talking about subgenres of music, they're all hippies. But there are some people who are more politically engaged and educated, and there are some who are just like drug addicts. But they're all that movement. Like this many years removed from that, it's still, they would get lumped together by historians, don't you think?
Except I would have been Joni Mitchell, Janice Ian, Ian and Sylvia, in terms of political parts, certainly Baez and Dylan. I don't know. I don't think of them getting lumped with the Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix and...
See, being alive at that time, you have a different perspective, like in my generation, there might be like goths and punks and metalheads, but then like way removed from it, they're all just rockers. They all just like guitars. Do you know what I mean? So if you're in it, you see these distinctions. And if you aren't, it seems very, like what you explained it very eloquently, but they all seemed very similar because you like openly admitted that flower children or people who, they also might have been doing the exact same things the hippies were doing.
Right.
So.
Right.
So it
So you
blurs
could,
the lines.
so if you had a commune, you could find politicos, flower children, and hippies all in the same commune.
Yeah.
And they would have arguments about how to organize, or whether they should everybody should do their own thing versus different level of social consciousness. Some would be like, wow, this is a really cool place to kick back and have sex and do drugs. And others would be like, okay, let's work together to find this community, and let's create new open relationships, but not in a slovenly manner.
Yeah.
Let's put flowers on our...
So
let's decorate.
Did you yourself live on a commune at some point?
I didn't live on a commune. I visited a few communes.
My dad actually lived on one for a couple of years. So that was really fun to dive into some of that stuff. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about like your schooling. You mentioned before we were filming about your PhD maybe not happening in regards to being a woman.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that?
Well, let me kind of go back a little further than that.
Sure.
So I went from Queens. I followed some friends who had been out there in school out to Humboldt County, and I guess it was the closest thing to a commune. It was called Table Ranch.
So for people who don't know, that means you went from the East Coast
to the
North
West
Carolina,
Coast,
all the way to Northern California on the West Coast.
Yeah. At that time, you could go to the junior college free, even whether you were out of state. So I did that, and then you had in-state tuition at Humboldt or at any state college or university. You had to be a resident for 6 months. You had to be out of school, not be in school for 3 months. So I could come from Virginia here, go to school at the junior college, drop out for 6 months, get a job, and then have almost no tuition as a California resident.
And you went to,
I did that.
That's the school in Arcata?
Yeah.
That's a really cool town.
Yeah.
That's like...
It was a flower child and a hippie place.
Yeah, I mean, more so than Sebastopol, and it like still has... It's kind of like what Sebastopol, where we live, like what it was 30 years ago, it's still like that in Arcata.
Yeah.
And it's awesome.
Yeah, no, I really loved it. And I go back there because going to the junior college as a woman was probably much closer to what I thought I was doing when I went to college. First of all, I love junior colleges because if you're a bright student, your teachers don't have graduate students and PhD students. They have AA students, and they're looking for hungry, eager, bright people, and I would have been that. So I feel like I had access to, the brightest minds of junior colleges and people in art and science and philosophy and theater that were just eager to feed my hungry kind of body and mind and spirit. So I feel like I had the chance totally in a kind of equal way to do whatever I want and to see myself against men and women and to be encouraged by all my teachers to kind of do what I wanted. So I went on to get a master's at Hunter College in New York City and a PhD at the University of Denver. And the question, the situation that you mentioned is a discrimination and almost something that derailed my PhD, which is when you go to a PhD program, you come in with interest, and you often come in knowing of professors that you'd like to study under. Mm-hmm. And I had one of those. And it was heady, it was delightful. I was one of the only female graduate TA, teaching assistant, and most of us were all in this particular man's classes, and it was just a track that you went on. And then you get your last year to creating a dissertation proposal and choosing a person, and I created my proposal and took it in to the person I thought was obvious, and he sat down and looked more and more uncomfortable, and he said, I hate to tell you this, but when I married, which was his second wife, who had been a graduate student of his, I didn't know this, but he had not a great reputation for a long time, but he'd been married for about 4 years. He said, I promised her that I would never direct any female dissertations.
Because she didn't want it to repeat? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
Because she was like, if you do that again, you might end up just leaving me for them.
I said, well, it would be really nice to have known that. I mean, this is something that it seems like your female graduate students should know. And by the way, I can date you, but don't get too close because this relationship is going nowhere.
So were you able to switch to a different professor?
Well, I was terrified and irate. I was so angry. And I went to the department head who...
well, good for you.
I went to the department head. And, in this day and age, it would have been a sexual harassment suit.
Yeah.
In that day and age, he got very uncomfortable and didn't say much and came back to me a few days later and said, this is an uncomfortable situation, and I wish it hadn't happened. Your dissertation topic looks really good. How about if I direct it? And I said, well, he was an empirical small group.
Yes. Said that they would direct
he knew
it?
Absolutely nothing. It was a critical dissertation as opposed to experimental or empirical. He'd never ever, I don't know if he'd ever read one, let alone doing it. and he's looked more and more uncomfortable, and because I mean, it might have even been in the era where he still knew I could go above him and say this is not okay.
Yeah.
The compromise, though, was that my mentor and graduate advisor during my master's was the quintessential expert on the topic that I had. I was studying Hannah Arendt and human communication. And I said, well, that would work if you let me have an outside, unofficial advisor in Dr. Rosenfield. And he almost immediately said yes. It never happened before. I don't know if it ever happened again. So we basically, he was at Penn State, and my dissertation basically went back and forth to Pennsylvania, and he basically directed it, and everything got signed off by the head of the department. And that's how I got it. This other person was not even on my committee. I mean, it was just the most bizarre thing. And I still worried about whether I'd get my PhD because I still had to take orals. By this time, this would have...
That's like verbal exams?
Yes, and written exams. I hadn't taken either of those. And so in doing those, you take 1 hour for every 5 hours of courses. So most all of my coursework had been from this man, who's now been probably addressed by the department head and all the other people.
He might flunk you out of spite.
So he could have flunked me out. And he literally waited until the last hour before the deadline for letting people know whether they passed to turn in that I passed.
Yeah.
So
You think he was debating it?
Either
like,
he was debating
it,
or he was just angry, and that was just his last way of kind of saying, I still dangle this over you.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, discrimination, it still was not talked about. There were, after I had this experience, I started listening to the stories about this professor and some of my TAs that were not really being appropriate with young women. This is the flower child thing. I just would not have been open to seeing that shadow, dark side.
Yeah.
I was still completely kind of idealistic and naive about it. But that was like the opening, that was all around me. Some of my fellow TAs were, having inappropriate relationships with their students, and my faculty members were having those. And then I looked around and realized that we had no women in the faculty. The one woman that came when I came was kind of let go before I finished my dissertation. So, yeah, I still didn't want to see it. In 1972, I wanted to believe that things had changed much more than they had.
Because it was a very idealistic time for change, right?
Yeah, you kind of thought that was happening.
So, I look back at that time because my parents, got arrested marching in D.C., and they were like, we're going to change the world. And in some ways they did, but I feel like a lot of them then went on to just sort of settle down and live the suburban American lifestyle. Do you feel like that generation could have done more than it did to on large issues like climate change or women's rights and sexual harassment?
You mentioned that things, when you look back at them 50 years, they get mixed together. Mm-hmm. My experience, let's use Tom Hayden for an example.
I'm not familiar with it.
Tom Hayden was married to Jane Fonda. It's one of the things he's thought about. Okay. He was one of the Chicago Seven, so I'm pretty sure that's right. I think he's in the yes, because I sat in Madison, Wisconsin, learning how to grab arms in anticipation of the '68 Chicago Convention. I didn't go, but anyway, he was he would have been a politico, very active in changing the world and in anti-Vietnam War. He went on to be a senator from California. I think that's. You may want to fact check me because I'd hate to be on this interview giving all the wrong facts. But he went from trying to change the system outwardly peacefully to outwardly more aggressively to inside the system politically. And I think there were a number of people from my generation that tried to do that. Yeah. They're kind of lost in the sea of people that, as you say, may have gone back to to normal lives. Well, so the kind of disappointment or what happened to people. I think that a lot of things that have to do with the environmental movement, or certainly Whole Foods and food stores, that all started with my generation. The health food store was called on, and organic foods were called on, were by people of the 60s and 70s.
They were the first people who were like, hey, we don't want this monocrop, pesticide-filled agriculture.
Yeah. People behind came and created Whole Foods. I mean, my generation then was having families and doing that and trying to feed us you Whole Foods and getting you to idealistic schools to the most that they could.
Yeah. But it becomes a profit business. You know, we live in a money-controlled world, and things get less pure when they're upscaled to become giant corporations.
Right. Having and raising a family and providing for it probably is universal over time. It takes changes. Although you've done a great job of trying not to not compromise and raise children and have a farm and have this.
I'm trying, but there was a time where we bought everything packaging free in bulk locally. And we couldn't afford to do it once we had kids because they eat so much. So there's like the reality of the situation is that it's hard to be with your values 100% of the time if you don't have tons of money. And how do you get tons of money? So
do you go to Costco?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Because
and now they have organic and they have bulk.
Yeah, we buy organic food from them. But like, so for a small example, we would get our almond butter in a jar where you bring your own glass jar and they grind the nuts for you, and then there's no packaging, and it's like organic almonds from California. It's $25 for that jar. It's $8 for a jar at Costco.
Yeah.
And when you have kids going through stuff like that, and that adds up exponentially to like quadruple your food bill. We just couldn't do it.
And I think that's an example that goes back maybe forever. But
I want to get back to you.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned families and being parents, so could we dive into that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely.
Question is, how did you figure out how to become a parent literally? Like, was that easy or hard for you? And then, to get pregnant, that is. And then, once you became a parent, how was that transition? You're now caring for other people. They become almost more important than you, which is why self-care as a parent is always challenging, especially when you have little babies. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. But I have to go back kind of the step to becoming a parent.
Should we talk about Jean first?
No.
No?
No. We have to go back prior to Jean because I came from
There's a father here, so
I came from a fairly dysfunctional family. I had parents I had no other brothers and sisters. I had parents that shouldn't have gotten married. They were getting separated and not separated from literally before I was born. I think my mother left thinking she was going to get divorced. So I grew up with no models of a family with kids and adults. I grew up half the time mostly with my mother. When I grew up with both of my parents, they literally lived in separate rooms and had separate lives. And I've always been kind of introverted and introspective. And so pretty early, like certainly by preteens, I was, thinking, well, I want to have a relationship. I don't want to have a relationship like my parents. And I don't want to be a parent if I'm a parent. I may not be a parent. I don't want to do it like that. And then one day I woke up and thought, well, how do you think you're going to do it? I mean, what does that look like? And it was terrifying. I had no idea what it would look like. But because I was kind of...
you were single at the time when you already knew you wanted to be a parent.
Well, no, when I would have been in junior high and college, even in graduate school, I had the position that I don't want to be a parent. Okay. And I think if you were a woman in the 60s, before the kind of you can do everything, I think there was a lot of us that thought the only way we could be taken seriously is if we didn't have children early, but we put all that on the back burner and we had to get taken seriously.
It's still true to this day. Like women who want to build careers have kids late.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or they have them really early and that's
maybe that's social stigma, but I also think it's life circumstances. It is very hard to have small children and get a degree or work 60 hours a week trying to build a really serious career.
Yeah.
It's just hard. So it makes more sense to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, and this goes to your eldership and why I think it's so important, I decided the only way I could do that is to start studying really fast. Parents of friends of mine, hanging out at their house, literally asking them questions, kind of like you're interviewing.
Yeah.
How did you meet? How did you decide to do this? Did you always know want to have children? And I started studying that in high school. And when I went on to college, and I would go to my cousins many were 10 or 12 years older than me, and saying, how did you meet your husband? How did you get this relationship? What's the hardest thing about being parents? And I did that for years. I didn't meet Gene until I was 30, and I didn't get married till I was 32. He was a couple of years younger.
What year that was?
We got married in 82, so we met in 80. I finished my PhD in 77.
You guys just hit 40 years recently.
I might be off a little while. It's 39 this year, so
okay.
82. We got married in October of 82.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Not everybody lasts that long.
No.
Marriage is not easy.
No. And it could be a whole other interview. But
sure. Maybe next time.
Yeah, because none of this, because I didn't have a template for a marriage or a relationship or kids, I really studied everything through again, cousins and relatives. And I didn't deserve to find a solid, great husband. And it was in some ways strategic. I mean, I had to really study it and look at, what would work and what wouldn't work, and apply those standards. And I lucked out with finding a great partner and mate. But that's been really hard a lot. And so that goes to your question, going back to having children. I was going to adopt. That was my 60s socially conscious, too many children in the world.
Us too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we learned Christy worked with kids that were adopted and troubled youth, and
and genetics and medicine and
a lot of the kids that are up for adoption had parents that were drug addicts, and that can be really intense because anyway. You speak, not me, please.
Yeah, and just finding other people that have IQ and health, and pretty much IQ and health in adoptive population is not easy. Now with fertility stuff, finding egg donors and sperm donors and things, but then you're not in adoption anymore. You're just in lots of money activities.
Yeah.
So when I met Gene, though, I think that was one of our agreements. Was he wanted a child, and then we could consider adoption. And once I went down the route of having a child and falling in love, I still intellectually thought adoption would be good, but I just wanted more little Genes and little Elizabeth. And it was, as you know, being a wonderful parent, it's just such an amazing thing, and then hoping that you can do the things that didn't happen when you were growing up and all the things did that you loved. But we ended up finding that I had infertility with blocked tubes from the early days of being sure I was not going to be one of those ones that got pregnant. And I had a Delcon Shield, which was an early IUD that everybody got infertility with.
Oh, so it causes permanent problems.
Yeah, wow. It had a tail on it that was a focus for bacteria just going right up into your ovaries. And
are they able to correct that?
No, I had lots of surgery, big surgeries, and I don't think that's worth going into. So they corrected part of it, but it was a little like the eggs are trying to jump out of an airplane, but the chute doesn't open. There's no way to catch them.
Do you mind if I ask you, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, did that affect you every month? Like with your egg release?
No, it didn't affect, my eggs were releasing fine. They were just falling into a big void, and maybe 1 in a million would get to my fallopian tube. They might just be released and disappear into my abdominal cavity. And you can do whatever you want with it. So that was a shock, and we found that out. We got married and tried to get pregnant immediately, so our marriage started with infertility, which many relationships, even if they didn't start there, end with infertility because it's so
that was
hard.
a hard time for you guys.
Yeah, and that was 4.5 years. Nate was conceived on a first try IVF. So there was the whole, how do you get money? And we had borrowed money from my father, and because there's so much more now, but it was $5,000 then outside of travel fees to do that per cycle. Nathan was born. But for Jeffrey, it took 4 cycles.
Wow.
And that's repeatedly shots and tests and failures and spending money with failures and raising debt. And so just to be a parent.
It was not easy.
Yeah, it was not easy. And then Jeffrey was a twin.
I did not know that.
Well, the fetus was reabsorbed somewhere around 24 weeks, so it wasn't a traumatic thing. But we were very excited to have two.
Now, did that cause any growth issues with Jeff?
No,
it was early enough.
No, it was
that
all
wasn't a
absorbed
problem.
and not a problem at all.
But
it was
hard?
a loss.
So you had
it was
a
the first
partial
loss.
Miscarriage, which
I never even knew it was a miscarriage. It was just when you do IVF, you are monitored regularly. So you go in for a lot of sonograms, and so there was several sonograms, and then a third sonogram. There was just nothing. It wasn't like anything traumatic had happened. I would have not known it.
So it wasn't a hardship.
No, except that it was. We had so many lost cycles through infertility and lost innocence of having babies the natural way, that the excitement and joy of, oh wow, out of all this comes these 2 little beings. And again, for an only child, the idea of having a twin, it's one for a parent having different children, but thinking as an only child of like, wow, I have a twin, I have someone that was in there with me.
Built-in best friend.
Yeah, so it was an early loss. And,
well, I've heard from a lot of parents with twins that it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Especially for moms, the double nursing is it almost puts you out. So.
Except, you don't know me well, but you know me through some difficult things, crises. I probably do better under stress, and I weed trees really well when they really have weeds in them.
For the viewers out there, Betsy loves weeding so much that she'll come to my farm and weed for fun. I hate weeding, so I'm very grateful.
And just to finish that, when I first convinced Isha to let me do it, he took me to this, carrot garden with about 7 weeds and strawberries, and said, well, you can weed here. And I just looked at him like,
I do try to keep up with the weeds.
Do you not like me? What? These are weeds?
Oh, you'd hate my orchard now. We put down 30 yards of wood chips. There's no weeds in the whole thing.
I could find something. I know, and I'm really eager to have there be no weeds. It's just that's one of the things I'm good at. I like the process, and I like watching you couldn't get the wood chips in until we got the weeds out.
Yes, exactly.
So, yes.
So let's circle back to being a parent. We've talked about the difficulty of getting pregnant, and that's quite a journey. But so then you have kids, and
parent.
You have to learn how to take care of other children, and you've already said you did not have a good model for that growing up. So how did you go through that journey? How did you learn how to care for your kids? And I know it wasn't easy.
No. On a very basic level, we didn't want our mothers to be there. Not that I wouldn't have wanted his mother to be there, but if his mother was going to be there, my mother had to be there. And my mother being there was not a great idea. So a lot of things, all growing up of our kids, was not seeing Jean's side of the family because it became so mean to my mother. And she was a lovely woman. She just had serious issues. So we didn't want mothers there when we had babies. And I thought, well, how hard can it be? When I look back and I see people that have mothers there or somebody or sister in those 6 weeks, those early times, I just think, oh my God, how did I do it without that? And how wonderful that people have aunts and uncles and parents. But a good example of not knowing is I was going to, of course, not do plastic diapers. We were going to have the real fresh diapers and stuff. And
we did that with number 1, but number 2, we did not have the energy. Did you do it both times?
I did it both times. I had more crossover with 2 about where going out and stuff.
Yeah,
with 1, it was
us,
pretty much almost everything. Yeah. But and I looked at the how do you do a diaper and stuff. But I was going through an awful lot of diapers, and when Nate was about 4 months old, I went back very part-time to a mental health clinic to work. And I hired this very experienced nanny who came in, and she came upstairs when I was doing a diaper. And she just looked at me like,
"You're doing it wrong?"
Well, yeah, because, when you use cloth diapers, usually you use 2 diapers, and you make, I don't know how you do it, but you take the one of them and you fold it in 3 parts down the middle of the baby, and then the other part, it comes around and ties. So where you need the diaper, you have like 4 layers of diaper, and then you have the 1 layer. But I was just taking 1 diaper, so there was 1 level where you needed to be, and this wad of stuff at the top to do the diaper. So
well, that's how we learned how to do it. Maybe they're different shapes in the modern ones in those ways.
I'll tell you, using the 2 diapers,
ours were just rectangles.
You could have 4 times. It was not like, because you are using 2 diapers, you could say, well, you'd change them once an hour. No, it was exponential.
Yeah, I found that cloth diapers needed to be changed like every pee, which is like 30 minutes when you have little kids.
I think you never learned how to do that.
Well, we watched the YouTube videos. And we had a diaper service.
Yeah.
So they literally tell you this is how you use our product.
Yeah.
And it was 1 diaper with these little snap things that held it in place.
Yeah.
And then there was a diaper cover that was made out of a wool that absorbed a little bit more.
Yeah, because we were all organic-y people.
Yeah.
You were too. Yeah. Yeah, so that was kind of an example. Again, I went back to my cousins and friends and my aunts and uncles, even from another generation, and did a lot of study. I mean, I certainly read books, and by that time I had a PhD in communication. I had all but another master's in developmental psychology, and I had a postdoc in attachment and bonding, so I'd been studying the emotional life of toddlers and infants, and Nathan was part of a study to be able to look at healthy development for a year. And
does that mean that he was diagnosed with ADHD young then?
No. It was just the program that I did my postdoc in was wanting to study normal children first year of life. So I'd go in every month. No, he wasn't diagnosed until 5th grade, maybe.
Oh, okay.
And he never, ever accepted the diagnosis. And much later in life, there was some question about it. Not in my mind, but it was always a gray area, and the grayness made it very difficult because he never wanted to do the medication for it, even though
it's very hard to be told you need to take something
right,
every day.
Even though his communication, his penmanship, his art, his attention, everything was radically improved for the short period of time that he was doing.
I want to thank you very much for joining me. I really had fun chatting with you, and I hope you're up for doing it again sometime.
Yeah, I would love to do it again. I think it's a very exciting project, and
thank you.
I think none of us can know enough about eldership, and I'm really glad that you're pursuing it. Maybe that's something that your generation will do better than ours or past generations.
We're so lucky to have this technology to very easily capture these memories. You mentioned that you've done some interviews, but it was tapes and then dictation.
Yes.
This is so easily digestible. It makes it very enjoyable to film and watch.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
So, yes, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you
I look
so
forward
much.
to coming back.
Awesome.